In this video, I'll be showing you how to make all the various accents and attachments for the movie-era engineering radiation suits. This is part 3 in a 4-part series, in which I'll be walking you through each element of the entire costume ensemble. In part 1, we covered the collars. In part 2, we covered the jumpsuit body, and now we'll be going through all the stuff that goes on the jumpsuit. I'm also posting the entire costume tutorial on my blog, www.StarTrekCostumeGuide.com, where you can read through everything in detail. It'll also be available as a free PDF download once I've completed the series. This tutorial walkthrough is intended for use with my Tailors Gone Wild sewing patterns, which are available at www.tailorsgonewild.com. For these, I had the privilege of studying and patterning directly off a screen-used engineering radiation suit, thanks to Raymond Arsick. And if you enjoy this free tutorial, please support my costume research on Ko-fi. This helps me be able to produce more sewing and costuming resources like this. So let's dive in. This particular costume is a bit beyond what I would normally attempt to demonstrate, because it has quite a bit of non-sewing related DIY for all the accents and attachments. I'm primarily, almost exclusively, a sewing and tailoring guy. Things like accessories and props aren't at all my area of expertise. But having had the privilege of studying a screen-used costume, I was able to reverse engineer how a lot of it was originally done, and I'll be showing you how we can reproduce similar results for our costuming and cosplaying purposes. I did make some minor compromises here and there, mostly for the sake of convenience. In some cases, the following materials and techniques aren't the only way to achieve satisfactory results. I chose the ones I did in an attempt to achieve the best overall balance between authenticity and fidelity to the originals, aka screen accuracy, ease and convenience, especially for those with limited access to and/or skill with power tools, and the most accessible and least expensive materials. I will occasionally mention some alternate materials and techniques, as well as what I believe their pros and cons to be. The division-colored shoulder tabs on the engineering radiation suits were commonly seen on many of the other uniforms from the motion picture, and they continued to be used on their modified Wrath of Khan era successors. However, the engineering division color was red in the motion picture, and it was changed to gold for the Wrath of Khan onward. Although the Wrath of Khan era trainees were red with a diagonal gold slash on their left sleeve bands, they wore the same gold shoulder tabs as the officers and enlisted crew. Obviously, you want to use the appropriate division color for whichever version/era of the engineering radiation suit you're making. While you're of course free to use whatever fabric you like, if a satisfactory retail color eludes you, you may be interested in dyeing your own. Also, as a budget-friendly alternative to wool gabardine, I suggest using cotton twill for the division-colored fabric on the shoulder tabs. As of the making of this tutorial, I haven't examined a screen-used motion picture era uniform with the engineering red shoulder tabs, so as with the trainee collar, the ideal target color is open to a degree of interpretation. After a series of experiments for both acid dyes for wool and fiber-reactive dyes for cotton, I suggest using the following dye recipes. With the exception of the acid gold and yellow, these dyes are all from Dharma Trading Company. Gold and yellow is from Pro Chemical and Dye. For wool, a mix of 70% fire engine red and 30% gold and yellow, dyed at 0.8% depth of shade, looks about right to me. For cotton, a mix of 50% light red and 50% deep yellow, dyed at 6% depth of shade, also looks about right. The component colors and custom mixes are both standard 1% stock solutions, with the acid dye powder dissolved in boiling water. Please remember that this is my current interpretation of the TMP red division color. It's my best informed, educated guess for the time being, but I'm hardly infallible. For the Wrath of Khan era engineering gold, I did have the opportunity to closely match the screen-used fabric color on both wool and cotton twill. For wool, a mix of 79% gold and yellow, 9% fire engine red, and 12% peacock blue, dyed at 0.3% depth of shade, is a very close match to the original fabric color. For cotton, a mix of 89% deep yellow, 5% light red, and 6% cobalt, dyed at 3% depth of shade, is also a very close match. Both of these were with standard 1% stock solutions, with the acid dye dissolved in boiling water to make the solution. If you have no idea what this means but are interested in learning, I'm planning to produce a Tailors Gone Wild fabric dyeing course after my sewing and tailoring courses are finished. If that's something you're interested in, then drop by www.tailorsgonewild.com and subscribe to my Sewing Wizard newsletter. The shoulder tabs are comprised of 2 layers. A base layer of black felt, piece K1, and a slightly larger layer of division color fabric, piece K2. The felt base should be 1 inch wide, and the division colored fabric should be 1 3/8 inches wide. The division colored fabric, piece K2, includes a 1/4 inch allowance along each edge. I suggest stitching a 1/4 inch from the edges with black thread to establish a guide for pressing under the allowances. Press the 1/4 inch allowances under along the stitching lines. Center the division colored fabric over the black felt base. There should be a 1/16 of an inch of black felt showing along each edge of the tab assembly. Using matching red or gold thread, hand sew the division colored fabric to the felt base. Then hand sew the shoulder tabs to the jumpsuit using black thread. I suggest centering the tabs over the shoulder seams and horizontally positioning them about 1/8 of an inch away from the armscye/sleeve seams. At first I experimented with more advanced hand sewing stitches like whip stitching and fell stitching, but I actually achieved my best results with a basic running stitch along the felt. The black felt is so dark that the black thread is all but invisible anyway. The circular left chest accent was only on the Wrath of Khan era engineering radiation suits, so skip this step if you're making a motion picture era version of the costume. The base is a circle 1 3/4 inches in diameter. Although the original was metal, for this you can also use a small circle of thin craft wood, or cut one yourself out of 2mm craft or EVA foam. I suggest using wood. My local Joann carries this package selection of assorted craftwood circles, including a few which were exactly 1 3/4 inches in diameter. And as you might recall from my screen-used costume examination, the sticky uppy bit in the middle is called an automotive grease fitting. Drill a hole in the center of the base, wide enough for your automotive grease fitting to fit through, probably about 1/4 inch. Also drill 21 to 23 small holes, about 1/16 of an inch wide, close to the edge around the perimeter. The left chest accent on the screen-used costume I examined had 23 holes, but some others only had 21 or 22 holes. Although not strictly accurate, I made 20 holes purely for convenient math. Spacing the holes about 1/4 inch apart resulted in 20 evenly spaced holes around the perimeter of the circle. On the left is a craftwood circle from the Joann package I mentioned, and on the right is a circle cut with 2mm craft foam. Painting your left chest accent is another subjective issue. The original piece appears to have been steel, although it wasn't anywhere near pristine. I think it may have either tarnished a bit with age, or perhaps it was intentionally dulled so it would be less shiny on screen. I tried several different paints, but didn't find a metallic steel paint color I liked, so I used a mix of Folk Art Metallic Gunmetal Gray and Folk Art Metallic Silver Sterling. You can add little faux scorch marks outside the center hole if you want to mimic the appearance of the screen-used piece, but personally I see those as a byproduct of the soldering/welding process, rather than an intentional, desirable effect. You may also wish to apply a high gloss or semi-gloss clear protective coat or two to the painted base. Several of this costume's accents and their components can probably be found at your local hardware store, probably in the specialty section, which is organized by drawers at my local Lowe's. I have no idea if the organization system is standard across the multitude of Lowe's stores, but at mine the automotive grease fitting was in drawer J9/14. Here's the exact piece I used. It's actually a steel color. I don't know why brass is pictured. There is one problem to address, though. The long screw extends well beyond the back of the chest circle. On the screen-used piece, the excess screw length looks like it was sawed off and the screw soldered or spot welded into place on the underside. If you're using a metal base for your chest circle and have a metal cutting tool, then this is probably a good option for you. But if you're using wood or foam for your base and or don't have access to a metal cutting tool, we need to work around that extra screw length on the underside. Depending on the length of the screw and width of your base, one option is to back your base with a thin metal washer and solder your automotive grease fitting to that instead. This is a viable option, but the extra bulk on the underside of the circular base may cause some slight pulling on your jumpsuit fabric, so I only recommend this if your screw and washer are otherwise very flat against the back of the base. My preferred option is to fasten the automotive grease fitting to the circular base with a small nut on the underside. Be sure to use a nut the same size and thread count as your grease fitting. Of course, this creates a great deal of bulk on the underside, which we'll deal with momentarily. Paint the little dome tip at the top of the automotive grease fitting black, and your left chest accent assembly is now complete. On the left is the screen-used piece, and on the right is the replica. If you fastened your automotive grease fitting to the base with a nut like I did, I suggest making a small buttonhole on the upper left front of the jumpsuit where the accent will be positioned. However, note that all the other era-specific elements of the costume are interchangeable. You could theoretically swap out various components for a motion picture, Wrath of Khan officer/enlisted, and or trainee version, but by making this buttonhole you're committing to one of the Wrath of Khan era versions, unless you don't mind a TMP jumpsuit with an inappropriate buttonhole. Remove the washer and nut from the back of the assembly. Insert the back of the automotive grease fitting through the buttonhole, slide the washer over the fitting on the underside of the jumpsuit, and then screw the nut onto the back of the fitting. If you made your circular base out of foam, be careful not to twist the nut too tight. Doing so will draw the grease fitting closer, squeezing it into the soft foam and contorting it. Using off-white thread, hand sew the accent to the jumpsuit through the small holes along the outer edge. The bullseye assembly is the small circular accent at the center of the chest circles. This assembly is comprised of 7 smaller components. Pictured left to right, we have a 2 1/4 inch circular base, a layer of black mesh fabric/screen, a cylindrical extension, a second 1 3/8 inch layer, another layer of black mesh fabric/screen, a 1 inch metal washer, and a 1/4 inch round dowel. As with the left chest accent, the 2 primary layers of the bullseye assembly can be made with thin craft wood or 2mm craft or EVA foam. Although I definitely recommend using wood for the left chest accent, in this case either option will produce a good result. On the left is a wooden circle, on the right is a foam circle, and in the center is the actual screen-used bullseye assembly from the screen-used engineering radiation suit I examined. Paint your base and second layer. DecoArt Metallic Rose Gold is a close match to the color of the original base and second layer. Cut a small 3 inch by 3 inch square, or any shape larger than your bullseye base, of your black mesh fabric/screen. Ideally, I suggest using one with a thick circular pattern like the originals, but in lieu of that, here's the one from my local Joann that I used. Apply a generous amount of E6000 clear spray glue to your black mesh fabric/screen and place it on top of your bullseye base. Mash the layers together, wash your hands thoroughly afterward, and let it dry for at least several hours. It dries much more slowly than the E6000 tube glues. Once the glue is dry, carefully trim the black mesh from the underside so it's flush with the edges of the base. For the cylindrical extension, you can really use whatever you like. Wood, craft foam, metal, or anything else you can find that's 1 inch in diameter and 1/2 inch tall. You can also stack multiple layers to achieve the desired height. One of the easiest options is to use 3 layers of 6mm craft or EVA foam glued together. I found these handy flathead plugs at my local Lowe's, which I used for this. The problem is that one of them isn't quite tall enough, but 2 of them stacked together are too tall. So for mine, I used 1 flathead plug and 1 thin circle of 1-inch craft wood, which I glued together with Gorilla Wood Glue. This brought the cylindrical extension up to about the proper height. Whatever you use, paint the outer surface black and drill a hole in the middle for the center dowel. On the second layer of your bullseye assembly, paint a black circle just under 1 inch in diameter. Drill a hole through the middle of the second layer as well for the center dowel. Cut another small 2-inch by 2-inch square of your black mesh fabric / screen. Paint the middle area golden yellow. It may take several coats, and I ultimately just had to cake it on there so the paint was very thick and clogged the holes in the mesh. I used top-notch champagne for this, and it turned out okay, but the original was definitely more of a lighter yellow color. Paint a small silver circle in the middle, about 3/8 of an inch to 1/2 an inch in diameter. I used top-notch metallic silver for this. After the paint dries, poke out the holes with the implement of your choice. I used a large hand sewing needle. A seam ripper would work too. If that doesn't work, just draw or paint little black circles where the holes should be. I used a black Sharpie. Trim your mesh into a circle just under 1 inch in diameter and trim out a 1/4 inch circular hole in the middle for the dowel. Apply some E6000 spray glue to the underside of the painted mesh, then glue it onto the second bullseye layer over the black area, matching center holes. I'm honestly not sure what the center rod was made out of on the originals, but a 1/4 inch wooden dowel works fine. On the screen-used engineering radiation suit I examined, the dowel extended past the second layer about 3/8 of an inch, although this does seem to have varied. This fellow's, for instance, appears to have been a bit longer. And some of them didn't even have dowels / rods at all, although I believe these to have been erroneous omissions rather than intentional design choices. Personally, I like the proportions of the screen-used bullseye assembly I examined. If you do too, cut a 7/8 inch segment of your 1/4 inch wooden dowel. Painting the shaft with top-notch metallic pearl and the tip DecoArt Gloss Enamels red produces a very similar result to the screen-used rod. As you might recall, some rods were all white and didn't have the red tips, most notably Scotty in The Wrath of Khan, so feel free to omit the red if you prefer that look. Apply a bit of the E6000 glue or Gorilla Wood Glue to the top of the black cylinder extension and to the shaft of the painted wooden dowel, then insert the dowel through both pieces simultaneously to glue the layers together. The silver washer on the second layer is apparently a specialized piece, and I wasn't able to find one like it at my local hardware stores. It's 1 inch in diameter with a large 3/4 inch hole and about 1/8 of an inch deep, or tall. The closest thing I found was called a machine bushing, which closely matched 2 of the 3 dimensions. The problem, though, is that it was too flat. One option is to glue a couple of these washers together to form a taller washer assembly that looks the part. Another option is to use one of the flathead plugs that I mentioned earlier, although these are obviously way too tall. For my silver washer, I glued 2 1-inch craft circles together. 2 of these craftwood circles are roughly equivalent in height to the original silver washer. Carefully drill out a 3/4 inch hole in the middle with a large 3/4 inch drill bit and lightly sand the washer assembly. Paint the washer silver. I used Folk Art Metallic Silver Sterling for this. Apply a thin strand of E6000 glue to the underside of the washer and glue it to the second layer so it just barely covers the edges of the painted mesh. I recommend applying a clear protective gloss coat to this subassembly. And finally, apply some E6000 glue to the underside of the black cylindrical extension and glue the subassembly to the base. Here's a comparison between the screen-used bullseye assembly on the left and this replica assembly on the right. Although the bullseye assembly is now finished, I recommend waiting until the end of the entire construction process to attach it to the jumpsuit. As I've mentioned previously, the original Edelrid, not sure how to pronounce that, climbing buckles used on the Wrath of Khan era jumpsuits don't seem to be available anymore, but you do have several options for replicating them. Eric Olds, also known as Felga Carb, offers 3D printed buckles on Shapeways. As of the making of this tutorial, I haven't used these or seen them in person, but they look fantastic. If you can afford them, they're probably the best looking and most convenient option. However, they are expensive, currently almost $72 a pair, so if that's beyond your current costume budget, you might consider making replicas out of wood or craft foam. It's easy to replace the buckles later, if you ever decide you want to upgrade to the 3D printed ones when you have the inclination and/or means to do so. When shaped, sanded, and painted well, wood looks much better than craft foam, but obviously you need some tools, specifically a drill and a rotary saw with a sanding bit to work with it. I used a beam of craft wood 3 inches wide and 3/8 of an inch thick. Foam sheets are cheaper, plus both faster and easier to work with, but in my opinion, the final result doesn't look nearly as good. Should you decide to use foam, I suggest using some at least 6mm thick. For both TMP era buckle styles, though, the 6mm craft foam works great. For those of you who are interested in making the buckles yourself, my Tailors Gone Wild patterns include 2D patterns for both TMP buckle styles and a close approximation of the Edelrid buckles. If you have experience and skill working with wood and/or craft foam, then obviously make them using whatever tools and methods you prefer. Personally, my skill set is limited in this area, so I began by tracing the paper buckle pattern, piece N3, onto the wood or foam with a marker. The foam can be easily cut with a sharp X-Acto knife or scissors. I cut the general outline of the buckle with a jigsaw, then rounded the edges with my rotary saw/sanding bit. For the upper hole, I first drilled out several holes, then chiseled out the bulk of it and sanded the interior edges into the appropriate curve. For both options, drill out the lower holes with a 1/2-inch drill bit. At this point, the disadvantage of using foam, at least as a novice like myself, is pretty obvious. The cornered edges don't look nearly as good as the rounded ones on the original metal buckles. But with wood, one can sand all the cornered edges into gently rounded ones. As with the circular left chest accent, I didn't find a metallic steel paint that I liked, although there are doubtless many other options I didn't try. To paint these buckles, I applied a couple base coats of Folk Art Metallic Gunmetal Gray, then a couple more coats of Deco Art Metallic Shimmering Silver. There are probably metallic silver rattle cans that produce faster, easier, and superior results, but I haven't tried any. I recommend applying a clear protective gloss coat to the buckles. Here's a comparison between a finished wood buckle on the left and a foam buckle on the right. As you can see, the wood buckle looks much better. I really only recommend the foam buckles as a last resort, unless your craft/EVA foam skills far surpass mine. Which isn't much of a stretch since, as I said, I'm a complete novice with foam. The TMP style buckles, pieces N1 and N2, look fine when made from craft foam though. For the TMP foam buckles, I applied a couple coats of the aforementioned Folk Art Metallic Gunmetal Gray. The buckles were attached to the jumpsuit with narrow loops of jumpsuit fabric. Cut one strip of fabric for the loops, piece N4. Fold the strip in half, vertically, the long way, and sew the strip closed with a short stitch length and 1/4-inch seam allowance. At this point, there are a couple different ways you can produce the individual loops. The first technique is to turn the strips out and roll the seam to the underside. You might try something like the Dritz clip and turn, but I've always found that to be frustrating and difficult.
I feel like I'm gonna break this damn thing.
I prefer to trim the seam allowances down to 1/8 of an inch, roll the seam to the underside, and press the seam allowances open. Trim the strip down into two lengths of 2.5 inches each. Sew the loops closed across the top with a short stitch length. Then I use a little miracle gadget called the Dritz Quick Turn to turn the closed loops right sides out. It's so much easier. Press the loops flat, then edge stitch the loops along both sides. Trim the loops down to 2¼ inches long. On the screen-used costume I examined, the loops were actually glued to the buckles. Apply some E6000 glue to the underside of your loop and wrap it around the top of the buckle, beginning with the raw end of the loop so it'll be covered, and ending with the top end of the loop on the underside of the buckle. Once the glue is dry, hand sew your buckle loops to the jumpsuit along the side edges of the front panel. Remember that these buckles were omitted for the Star Trek VI costumes, as well as the orange variants. As you might recall from my screen-used costume examination, I believe the left hip accent to have been a reflector box, like you might see on a tractor trailer. Unfortunately, if this is true, then they seem to have been a brand and/or model no longer available, which I suppose isn't very surprising since these costumes were originally made over 40 years ago. The closest retail product I was able to find was from Lowe's, but it's still a far cry from the screen-used piece. After fruitlessly searching for something even superficially similar in a comparable size, I ultimately decided to make my own replica reflector box. Should you wish to as well, I'll describe my process here for you. The materials and methods I used are, again, not the only way, but I'm pleased with the final result. Feel free to adapt and/or modify any part of this process if you like. For my replica assembly, I used a piece of wood 2 inches wide and 1/8 of an inch thick for the base. I used a piece of wood 3/4 of an inch wide and 1/8 of an inch thick for the walls. And I used a piece of wood 5/8 of an inch wide and 1/4 inch thick for the interior strips. The original box was approximately 4 7/8 of an inch by 1 7/8 of an inch, but I made mine slightly larger, and even 5 inches by 2 inches just for easy math, and because the craft wood I used for the base was 2 inches wide. Cut a 5-inch length of your 2-inch base, cut 2 5-inch lengths of your 3/4 inch wood for the longer walls, and cut 2 1 3/4 inch lengths of your 3/4 inch wood for the narrower walls. To mimic the angled interior strips on the original piece, I used a length of craft wood 1/4 inch wide and 5/8 of an inch tall. Cut 8 1 3/4 inch lengths and 7 1-inch lengths of this wood. Sand the upper/outer corners of the longer wood strips so they're gently rounded. Sand the upper/outer corners of the shorter strips so they're less gently rounded, and sand a little divot into the upper center. I used a rotary saw with a sanding bit for all this. Paint all these little pieces with the light, shiny paint of your preference. I used several coats of top-notch metallic pearl, which I believe nicely mimics the effect of the original piece. Paint the base and walls of the box as well. I used DecoArt metallic shimmering silver for the base, purely to provide some visual contrast. Center the thinner strips between the wider ones, alternating between them with the wider strips on the ends. Glue the strips together using either the E6000 clear glue or Gorilla Wood Glue. I also used a fine-tip metallic silver Sharpie to add some small dots for subtle detailing. Center the strip assembly and glue it onto the base. The original piece was 3/4 of an inch tall, so I suggest trimming 1/8 of an inch off your wooden walls. If you're using balsa wood, you can just use a sharp X-Acto knife. Glue the walls to the base and each other. I recommend applying multiple clear, high-gloss coats to the box interior. Cut a 5-inch by 2-inch rectangle of clear, heavy vinyl. 22 gauge was the heaviest available at my local Joann, but I think something even heavier might work better. Apply a thin strand of E6000 glue to the top edge of the walls and glue the vinyl to the outside of the box. My Taylor's Gone Wild engineering radiation suit patterns include pattern pieces for the piping frame, pieces O1 and O2 in this case, but you don't necessarily need them. They're just 2-inch wide bias strips cut to length and cornered. I cut a bunch of 2-inch bias strips in advance from my fabric scraps to have handy for this, the thigh panels, and the left sleeve panel. On all the edges of the reflector box, thigh panels, and left sleeve panel, the piping fabric cuts are the length of the corresponding edge plus 2 inches and cornered. In this case, the vertical lengths are 7 inches long, corner to corner, and the horizontal ones are 4 inches long, corner to corner. Sew one short length of piping, piece O2, to one longer one, piece O3, along one cornered end, right sides together and with a short stitch length. To help establish the sharp corner, first press the allowances under on one side. Then do the same on the opposite side. Turn out this portion of the piping frame assembly. I find it helpful to tightly pinch one pair of allowances together at the corner using tweezers when turning out the layers. Repeat for the opposite two edges, then join the two smaller assemblies together to form the whole frame. Cut 4 lengths of 1/4 inch cord, each about 1/4 inch shorter than their corresponding edges of the fabric. Insert the cords into the fabric frame as tightly as you can, then pin the fabric layers into place close to the cord. Using your zipper/piping foot, stitch the fabric layers together along the edges of the cord. Apply a generous amount of E6000 glue to the piping lip/allowance and along the lower edge of the box. Join the box and piping assembly. I suggest using multiple rubber bands to fasten everything snugly into place while the glue dries. Cut a 5-inch by 2-inch rectangle of off-white felt and glue it to the underside of the assembly. Here's a comparison between the screen-used piece and the finished replica. It's not perfect, but in my opinion it looks the part just fine on a finished costume ensemble. Hand sew the box assembly to the front left of the jumpsuit's waist tubing. The Wrath of Khan era thigh panel assembly is comprised of multiple pieces and layers. A base layer of ironing table fabric, piece P1, a backing layer of felt or flannel, also piece P1, an interfacing layer of heavy French canvas, again piece P1, an outer channel strip of ironing table fabric, piece P2, a middle channel strip of ironing table fabric, piece P3, 2 upper/lower channel strips of ironing table fabric, piece P4, and of course your piping frame, pieces P5 and P6. For the orange costume variants, substitute ironing table fabric for a closely matching orange fabric. As with the piping assemblies, there are pattern pieces for the various fabric strips used for the thigh panels, as well as those on the sleeve and gloves, pieces P2, P3, and P4 in this case, but you don't actually need them. I just cut some long strips of ironing table fabric 7/8 of an inch wide, 1 inch wide, and 1.5 inches wide in advance to have ready. Using black thread, serge one long edge of the outer channel strip, piece P2, both long edges of the middle channel strip, piece P3, one long edge of the upper channel strip, piece P4, and one long edge of the lower channel strip, also piece P4. Apply some fabric temporary spray adhesive to your backing felt or flannel and join it to the underside of your panel base, piece P1. Position the outer channel strip with the serged edge toward the middle of the panel and the other edges flush. Using gray thread, stitch the 4 horizontal tubing channels, reinforcing your stitching several times. The channels are centered, 1/2 inch wide, and spaced 1/8 of an inch apart. Edge stitch the upper, lower, and outer edges to the panel base. Position the middle channel strip so the closer end is 1 3/4 of an inch away from the serged edge of the outer channel strip. Top stitch the middle channel strip to the base along the opposite edge. Stitch the 4 horizontal tubing channels onto the middle channel strip, reinforcing your stitching several times. Position the lower channel strip onto the base with the serged edge toward the middle and the other edges flush. Stitch the vertical tubing channel into place, reinforcing your stitching several times. Also top stitch along the upper edge, ending your stitches at the channel stitching so the channel remains open. Repeat for the upper channel strip. Serge all 4 edges of the panel assembly with gray thread. Note that the thigh panels on the orange costume variants appear to have been covered with black binding or twill tape rather than overlocked. Prepare the piping frame assembly like I already showed you for the hip reflector box. Position the panel assembly onto the piping frame so the panel edges are flush with the edges of the cord. Using a zipper/piping foot in gray thread, top stitch the panel assembly to the piping frame 1/8 of an inch from the outer edges and cord. Apply a generous amount of E6000 glue to the underside of the panel assembly and glue your heavy French canvas to the underside. For officers and enlisted crew, you'll need some 1/4 inch and 1/2 inch black drainage tubing or fuel lines. And there are a couple important factors to keep in mind when choosing your tubing. First, the smaller tubing should be exactly 1/4 inch in diameter. Anything even 1/16 of an inch off will be noticeably too big or small, and the stitched tubing channels will not accommodate any tubing larger than 1/4 inch. Even 5/16 of an inch won't fit. Tubing products typically list both their inner diameter and outer diameter, and for costuming purposes here I'm only referring to the outer diameter. In my hunt for appropriately sized materials, I found that some product listing titles and descriptions varied up to 1/16 of an inch in either direction. In other words, one tubing labeled 1/4 inch outer diameter was actually 3/16 of an inch in diameter, and paradoxically, another was actually 5/16 of an inch. Ideally, you can bring your ruler or seam gauge to your local hardware store and measure the tubing/fuel lines there before buying. Mislabeled and mismeasured products are particularly problematic online since you're not able to verify them yourself before ordering. And even if the vendor offers free returns, you still lose the transit time while working on your costume. For your convenience, I've included links to the exact tubing I used on my blog, which I've confirmed to be the correct size. The second thing to watch out for is lettering on the tubing. If your tubing product has any, be sure to cut your strips around it. Cut a 4.5 inch length of the 1/2 inch wider tubing and 4 2.5 inch lengths of the 1/4 inch thinner tubing. Carefully insert the lengths of tubing into their corresponding channels. I found it helpful to hold the channel open with tweezers, using them like a shoehorn. Here's a comparison between the screen-used thigh panel assembly on the left and this replica panel on the right. For the Wrath of Khan era trainee version, you'll want to use translucent red tubing instead of black. Black, clear, and orange tubing are easy to find, but unfortunately red is more difficult. I don't know if red translucent tubing was more common back in the early 80s and has been subsequently replaced with orange, or if the tubing on the original costumes was just painted red. The relatively few translucent red tubing products I managed to find online either had poor reviews, one was described as actually being light pink, or were only available in one of the two sizes, thus risking a color mismatch. I did find an amazing company named Canal Plastics Center that sells dark red acrylic rods in both sizes. Unfortunately, this tubing is rigid and doesn't bend like the nylon or vinyl drainage tubing does. This makes it more difficult to insert into the tubing channels and more difficult to get the panel assembly to lie flat. It also needs to be cut with a saw and the ends sanded afterward rather than being able to be cut with scissors. The color is also a bit darker, more of a blood red that often photographs even darker than it actually is. In lieu of transparent red drainage tubing, this may still be the best option for Wrath of Khan era trainees. The only real issue is its inflexibility. The product itself is inexpensive, and they shipped my tubes literally 35 minutes after I placed my order. If this doesn't work for you, though, you might experiment with painting some clear drainage tubing and/or microfuel line to achieve the translucent red color. Here's a three-way comparison between the screen-used panel on the left, the aforementioned officer/enlisted replica panel in the middle, and a panel with this trainee tubing on the right. I've also lightened the red color a bit in Photoshop. Hand sew the thigh panel assembly to the jumpsuit directly underneath the waist tubing and slightly outside the hip reflector box, with the half-inch thicker tubing toward the rear. Repeat for the other side. For the TMP era thigh and left sleeve panels, I just used 6mm white craft foam and a fine-tip metallic silver Sharpie. If you're using off-white fabric for your jumpsuit, you may want to use an off-white foam that's a closer match to your fabric color. Cut a layer of heavy clear vinyl and glue it to the outside of the foam panel with clear E6000 spray glue. Then glue the foam/vinyl assembly to your piping frame assembly with regular E6000 glue. For the Wrath of Khan era engineering radiation suits, the sleeve patch is positioned at the top of the left sleeve, near the cap. As you might recall from my screen-used costume examination, I believe the TMP yellow patches were repurposed for the Wrath of Khan era radiation suits to complement the updated gold shoulder tabs and sleeve band. The TMP yellow patch from Pop Toys on eBay is an excellent match to the screen used. There are similar patches available from other vendors, but I haven't seen or compared any of them in person. That said, the ones from Entertainment Earth would be my second choice. As of the making of this tutorial, I haven't compared the Pop Toys TMP red patch to a screen used, so I can't attest to its accuracy, but it does look great to me in person. For the TMP era engineering radiation suits, the patch goes on the left forearm. In both cases, position the patch accordingly and hand sew it to the left sleeve with black thread. On the upper left sleeve is a panel assembly generally analogous to those on the thighs, but with different detailing. The Wrath of Khan era left sleeve panel assembly is comprised of multiple pieces and layers. A base layer of ironing table fabric, piece Q1, a backing layer of felt or flannel, also piece Q1, an interfacing layer of heavy French canvas, again piece Q1, a front channel strip of ironing table fabric, piece Q2, and a back channel strip of ironing table fabric, piece Q3. Using black thread, serge one long edge of your front channel strip, piece Q2, and one long edge of your back channel strip, piece Q3. Apply some fabric temporary spray adhesive to your backing felt or flannel and join it to the underside of your panel base, piece Q1. Position the front and back channel strips with the serged edges toward the middle of the panel and the other edges flush. Using gray thread, stitch the 8 horizontal tubing channels, reinforcing your stitching several times. The channels are 1/2 inch wide, with the top and bottom channels 5/8 of an inch from the panel edges. Serge all 4 edges of the panel assembly with gray thread. Note that like the thigh panels, the left sleeve panel edges on the orange costume variants appear to have been covered with black twill tape rather than overlocked. Prepare the piping frame assembly like I already showed you earlier. Position the panel assembly onto the piping frame so the panel edges are flush with the edges of the cord. Using a zipper/piping foot in gray thread, top stitch the panel assembly to the piping frame 1/8 of an inch from the outer edges and cord. Cut 8 2-inch lengths of your 1/4-inch tubing and insert them into the tubing channels. Over the back tubing channel is a decorative piece of plastic hardware, a bifolding door slide guide, N-6539, with 2 small holes drilled in each corner. Credit to users Tim, Flagweaver, and of course Felgacarb on the RPF for correctly identifying this piece over a decade ago. Drill 2 small holes in each corner of your door slide guide. I used a 1/16" drill bit. If you're using actual bleached white fabric for your jumpsuit, you can just use the piece as is. But if you're using off-white or cream fabric for your jumpsuit, you may want to paint the piece a color that's a close match to your fabric. I used Krylon ColorMax Satin Ivory for my gloves and boots, and the color is a close match to the screen-used door slide guide. If you're making an orange costume variant, paint your door slide guide a closely matching orange color. Apply a generous amount of E6000 glue to the underside of the panel assembly and glue your heavy French canvas to the underside. Using off-white thread, hand sew the door slide guide to the panel assembly over the back tubing channel through the pairs of holes you drilled. Here's a comparison between the screen-used panel on the left and this replica on the right. Strangely, both the black tubing and channels are the same size, but the tubing looks wider on my replica for some reason. I don't know why. I did try 3/16" tubing, but it was noticeably too small. Obviously, for Wrath of Khan era trainees, use the translucent red tubing instead of black. Hand sew the panel assembly to the upper left sleeve of the jumpsuit. For the motion picture era left sleeve panel, I simply used 6mm white craft foam and a fine-tip metallic silver Sharpie. The dimensions are probably the same as the Wrath of Khan era left sleeve panel, but sometimes it looks to me like the TMP sleeve panel is a tiny bit wider. It could just be an optical illusion though. Anyway, cut a layer of heavy clear vinyl and glue it to the outside of the foam panel with clear E6000 spray glue. Then glue the foam/vinyl assembly to your piping frame assembly with regular E6000 glue. On the lower left sleeve of the Wrath of Khan era engineering radiation suit was a division-colored sleeve band, generally analogous to those on the other uniforms of that era. The motion picture era engineering radiation suits didn't have these sleeve bands. Engineering trainees wore red with a diagonal gold stripe, while officers and enlisted personnel wore solid gold. The officers/enlisted crew sleeve band assembly is comprised of these pieces. My dye recipe for the Wrath of Khan era engineering gold sleeve band is the same as I mentioned earlier for the shoulder tabs. The trainee sleeve band assembly has a couple more pieces because of the stripe. As of the making of this tutorial, I haven't examined a screen-used trainee uniform, so as with the trainee collar, the ideal target color is open to a degree of interpretation. My trainee division color dye recipe is again my current interpretation of the color, not matched to a screen-used uniform or elements. It's simply my best informed, educated guess as of the making of this tutorial. With the exception of the acid Golden Yellow, these dyes are all from Dharma Trading Company. Golden Yellow is from Pro Chemical and Dye. For wool, I suggest a mix of 60% Fire Engine Red and 40% Golden Yellow, dyed at 0.8% depth of shade. For cotton, I suggest a mix of 60% Deep Yellow and 40% Light Red, dyed at 6% depth of shade. Both of these were with standard 1% stock solutions, with the acid dye dissolved in boiling water to make the solution. If you have no idea what this means but are interested in learning, I'm planning to produce a Tailors Gone Wild fabric dyeing course after my sewing and tailoring courses are finished. If that's something you're interested in, then drop by www.tailorsgonewild.com and subscribe to my Sewing Wizard newsletter. For both versions, cut 2 lengths of 3/16" cord to the same length as the rest of your sleeve band. Wrap your piping fabric, piece R5, around the 3/16" cord. Using off-white thread and a zipper/piping foot, sew the piping closed close to the cord. Repeat for the other length of piping. Position the black felt base over the lip of the piping so its edge is flush with the cord. Using black thread and a zipper/piping foot, edge stitch the felt to the piping close to the cord. Repeat for the opposite edge. For officers and enlisted crew, sew your band of gold fabric, piece R2, closed with 1/4 inch seam allowance. Roll the seam to the underside and press the seam allowances open. Turn the fabric band outward and press it flat. For the trainee version, sew the larger red bands, piece R3, to the diagonal gold stripe, piece R4, with 5/8 inch seam allowance and using red thread. Repeat for the opposite edge. Press the seam allowances toward the center over the gold band and trim away the excess corners of allowance along the upper and lower edges. Roll the seam to the underside and press the seam allowances open. Turn the fabric band outward and press it flat. For both versions, vertically center the division-colored fabric band over the black felt and hand sew it into place. I suggest slip stitching, and be careful not to pull your stitches too tight. Here's a comparison between the screen-used sleeve band on top, this officer/enlisted replica in the middle, and my interpretive replica of the trainee version on bottom. Wrap the sleeve band assembly around the sleeve of the jumpsuit to determine the appropriate allowance on the ends, and mark the seam line in the manner of your choice. Sew the sleeve band closed and press the allowances open. Feel free to trim the allowances smaller if you find them unwieldy, and have no plans to alter your jumpsuit and/or repurpose the sleeve band later. Hand sew the sleeve band assembly to the left sleeve of the jumpsuit directly beneath the sleeve tubing. Attach the pips and squeaks of your choice to the band. Also on the lower left sleeve of the Wrath of Khan era engineering radiation suit was a small rank mount, or bed, again analogous to those on the other uniforms of the era. The TMP era engineering radiation suits didn't have these rank mounts. The rank mounts generally conformed to the shape of the actual rank insignia. Trainees, enlisted crew, ensigns, and admirals all had rank mounts that were circular. Officers from lieutenant to captain rank had mounts that were more ovular to accommodate the longer rank pins. These rank mounts were composed of 2 layers, a piece of jumpsuit fabric, piece S2 or S4, and a smaller felt fabric backing, piece S1 or S3. Center your felt backing onto the underside of the jumpsuit shell fabric. Carefully turn the shell fabric allowance under a little at a time along the edge of the felt backing. Pleats will form along the curve, so distribute them as evenly as possible to keep the edge smoothly rounded, forming no corners. Tack the shell fabric allowance to the felt backing by hand, taking care to only stitch through the felt, so the stitches don't show on the outside of the rank mount. Hand sew the rank mount to the lower left sleeve of the jumpsuit, about 3/4 of an inch to an inch beneath the lower edge of the division sleeve band. And finally, attach the rank insignia of your choice. As I mentioned earlier, I suggest waiting until the jumpsuit is otherwise finished to attach the bullseye assembly to the jumpsuit. Apply a generous amount of E6000 glue to the underside of the bullseye assembly and insert it between the chest circles, or circle, on the upper front of the jumpsuit. Your jumpsuit is now finished. In part 4, I'll walk you through the gloves and boots to complete the costume ensemble. Just a reminder that this entire costume tutorial is available on my blog, www.StarTrekCostumeGuide.com, and it'll also be available as a free PDF download once I've finished this 4-part series. If you enjoyed this tutorial, if you found it interesting or helpful and would like to see more like it, please support my costume research on Ko-fi. This helps me be able to produce more sewing and costuming resources like this. And if you're wanting to learn how to sew, I'm putting together a series of sewing and tailoring courses which will be available soon. You can check those out at www.tailorsgonewild.com. Men's and women's sewing patterns for this costume are available there too. Anyway, thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe if you haven't already, and if you're able, I'd greatly appreciate your support on Ko-fi. See you again soon in part 4.